dear. Jesse, it's wanting me to go into a save as. Where should that be going?
You should be able to hit cancel.
I did. But when I press recorder, that's what it wants to go to.
All right, let's go without the recorder. I'm recording it on YouTube, so we should be okay.
Okay, we'll still do the countdown for purposes of this. All right, 3, 2, and 1.
Thank you for joining the July meeting of the Southern Nevada Strong Steering Committee. Madam Chairwoman, staff is ready for you to begin.
Thank you, Maren, and good afternoon. I'm Chairwoman Deborah March for the record. I'd like to call the meeting to order for the July 30th, 2020 meeting of Southern Nevada Strong Steering Committee. RTC staff will begin with a roll call of committee members, introduce staff on the line, and also touch on a few housekeeping items. I'd also like to add that the RTC encourages public participation. You can submit comments anytime before the end of the meeting to RTC to be read into the record at rtcsnv.com. Maren?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Maren Dubois, Management Analyst for the RTC for the record. I will be calling your name in alphabetical order. Please confirm your attendance as I read your name. Shane Ammerman.
Here.
Nicole Bungham. Nicole?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. Mike Casey?
Here.
Jocelyn Cousins? Jocelyn, are you on the line still?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry about that. I am here.
No problem. Thank you. Michael Deshari?
I'm here.
Bert Fielden? Robert, are you there? Bob? I hear sound. Brian Knudsen?
Here.
Thank you. Deborah March?
Here.
MJ Maynard?
Here.
Michael Mays?
Here.
Thank you. Andrew Rother?
Here.
Robert Summerfield?
I'm here.
Thank you. Also, please note that we have several RTC staff on the line for today's meeting. This includes Mr. Francis Julian, Deputy CEO, Mr. Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, Ms. Michelle Laramie, Senior Regional Planner, Mr. Paul Gulley, Management Analyst, and finally, Ms. Eileen Pastor, Government Affairs Supervisor, will be reading public comments. Additionally, Mr. Marco Volata from the City of Las Vegas and Mr. Mario Bermudez from Clark County Comprehensive Planning will be providing presentations to the committee. As the chairwoman mentioned, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Please state your name for the record before speaking. Be sure to mute your line if you are not speaking, but please note that staff will monitor lines and mute any callers with background noise. Voting will be done verbally as a group, calling for ayes and nays. If there are no nays or abstentions, then the motion will carry. If there are nays, then a roll call vote will be required. In the event of a roll call vote, please wait for your name to be read to provide your vote. The chairwoman will call for any comments or questions after an item has been presented. And finally, staff encourages participation from committee members. There is a raise your hand feature and chat on the WebEx to allow you to let staff know that you have a question or comment. But please note that the chat feature will be shared with the viewing public as well as those connected via WebEx. You can also unmute yourself as needed. We just ask that you mute when you are done speaking to minimize the amount of background noise. Thank you to the members for your participation in today's meeting. I will turn it back to you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Maren. And Mr. Rayburn?
Arch and members of the committee, Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, for the record. The first item on the agenda is to conduct your first citizens participation period. As you know, on March 22nd of this year, the State of Nevada Executive Department issued Declaration of Emergency Directive 006, which suspended the requirement to have a physical location for public meetings. Pursuant to Directive 006 and for the health and safety of the community, this meeting is being held telephonically. To allow for public participation, the RTC is accepting public comments via email at publiccomments@rtcsnv.com. Comments can be submitted to be read aloud or to be added directly to the written record. Ms. Eileen Pastor, Government Affairs Supervisor for the RTC, will read the public comments received by the RTC. Madam Chairwoman?
Thank you, Craig. This is the first time set aside for public comment. This time is limited to comments on items included in the agenda. Comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Eileen Pastor for the record, and there are no public comments to a posted agenda item.
Thank you. Mr. Rayburn?
Thank you, Chair March. Craig Rayborn for the record. The next item is to approve minutes of the May 28th, 2020 Southern Nevada Strong Steering Committee meeting. Please note that staff inadvertently left off Councilman Brian Knudsen, representing the Southern Nevada Regional Planning Coalition, from the attendees list on the minutes. We apologize for that oversight. Having said that, staff recommends approval of the minutes with that revision and consequently a revision to the voting list as well.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve from the floor?
Motion to approve as amended by staff.
And who is that made that motion?
My apologies, Mayor. Robert Summerfield, City of Las Vegas.
Thank you, Robert. We have a motion on the floor. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Rayburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Craig Rayborn for the record. The next item on the agenda is to receive an update on the regional work program. Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, will begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Ray Lathrop for the record. Our team is planning to provide an update on our formal work program at all of our meetings. And so you might remember last meeting, we talked about the Community Engagement Toolkit, the North Las Vegas Opportunity Site, and then introduced the work on our regional planning research projects. Today, we'll share more on those individual studies, and we'll highlight some interesting intermediary findings, which we hope will interest you in bringing some information back to your agency or organization and use it as a tool to further implementation of the regional plan. As a reminder, here's a list of the activities included in our role as core administrator of the regional plan. So next slide. Great. Next slide. I just want to take a minute to discuss one of those activities that we call outreach and communications. I just wanted to provide a little bit of an update on some of the additional work that we do as core administrators. We feel like it's very efficient for us to spend time in participating in groups around specific issue areas, because then we're able to align their goals with those goals of the regional plan. So in turn, these coalitions working in their own issue area can also be working on implementing the goals of the plan. So I just wanted to talk about a few examples of some things that our team has been continuing to work on over the last several months. So one example is I've been volunteering with the Nevada Housing Coalition, which is a statewide membership organization working on housing solutions. In alignment with the regional plan, the solutions to the state's housing challenge means increasing and preserving stock of affordable housing, as well as encouraging different types of housing to be considered. In recent weeks, this group has held a number of webinars to discuss the impacts of the pandemic on housing, provided policy recommendations to alleviate housing challenges, and we've been actively working on encouraging city, county, and state work together on rental assistance programs and other solutions. I feel like this work has been really helpful in implementing the regional plan and bringing more people into the same goals that the regional plan has. Also, I've been spending a little bit of time in the last few weeks with the Southern Nevada Health District Community Health Assessment. They have included in the last iteration of this plan several goals related to the built environment that align with the regional plan, like complete streets and overall public health outcomes within transportation. I'm continuing to participate during this cycle. They just sent out a big survey to collect input, and I can share it with all of you if you're interested in participating. But it's a great opportunity for us to have those framework documents of the health district also mirror and align with the regional plan. And finally, Paul has been very active in the Southern Nevada Food Council since it reformed in 2017. And they've been working closely with the health district on the first and second year of their Center for Disease Control REACH grant in order to convene small food retailers and discuss how to increase participation in federal nutrition programs and incentivize retailers to take advantage of those programs, specifically in food deserts. So I just wanted to highlight those things as far as outreach and communications, some of the ongoing work we do in partnership development. Next slide. The team will share updates on the 3 ongoing research projects that we're currently involved in. Just a note that the tree canopy and social equity impact study has not yet kicked off, as we've been trying to identify data needed to begin with that. So I will turn it over to Paul to talk about the extreme heat study first.
Great, thanks, Ray. Paul Gully for the record. Next slide. Great, so just a quick reminder that our goal with this extreme heat vulnerability study is to identify geographic concentrations of people who may be at greater risk during an extreme heat event in our region, and to work with partners and stakeholders to develop resources and tools and come up with recommendations needed to help mitigate the impacts of extreme heat and target resources in areas that are most vulnerable in our region. Next slide. Since our last steering committee meeting, we have created a project webpage that lives on the RTC website that provides an overview of the project and includes some additional resources that we'll be updating as we work through the study. Next slide. We also developed a fact sheet, which is included in your backup, that provides an overview of the study along with some extreme heat data specific to Southern Nevada. And we definitely encourage you to share this with others in your agency that may be interested in this work or connecting on this study. And we do plan to update the fact sheet as we progress through the analysis and have new data or findings to share. Next slide. And finally, earlier this month, we held our first technical advisory group meeting for the study. And the tag included a good mix of stakeholders with a really diverse set of expertise, which really lends itself to the interdisciplinary nature of extreme heat vulnerability. Next slide. And so as we work through the project, the tag is going to be helping us review and refine our methodology, our deliverables, and recommendations. So really every aspect and component of this work. They'll be helping us with data collection and, again, assisting with the development of recommendations based on the analysis. Next slide. And we're also working with them to make sure that we are creating final products and deliverables that that help folks understand this research, and more importantly, that can be used by partners to, again, target resources and interventions in communities that may be at greater risk. Next slide. So currently the tag members are in the process of reviewing and providing some feedback on the data we plan to use for the analysis. And once we get their input and we have agreement or consensus among the tag, we can run our analysis and then have preliminary findings to review at our next tag meeting and hopefully share at our next steering committee meeting as well. Next slide. Right, so moving on to the future housing needs analysis, which again aims to get a better sense for whether we as a region can expect to meet the future housing needs of our growing and changing population over the course of the next few decades. Next slide. Since the last steering committee meeting, we've continued to pull in data. We actually just got some updated housing unit projections that we can incorporate into our analysis. We've also done some additional research. We've spoke with some peer regions that have done housing studies similar to what we're looking at recently, and also reached out to some subject matter experts for insight into some of the research we've looked at. And we are also working on scheduling our first tag meeting for this project soon as well. Next slide. And one of the first things we plan to discuss with the tag is kind of the focus of our initial research. Because ultimately we do want to be researching and developing products that are of use to our partners. And there are a few different approaches or aspects of a future housing analysis that we could choose to prioritize first. These are kind of three that we're considering at this point. The first is kind of focusing on looking at overall balance in our region, so using population and housing forecasts to assess whether our region is expected to maintain a healthy balance of jobs and housing units. This would entail some research around the jobs housing ratio and potentially setting a target ratio for our region, which we haven't done. And this is how the DC region actually has set some of its housing goals and targets in recent years. Second option would be to focus more on affordability. So assess how much housing the region needs at different price points to ensure that housing is affordable across income levels. This would be similar to an analysis we came across that was done by SPUR, which is a Bay Area planning research organization. So they've looked at local income levels to estimate the number of units the region would need to build at different price points to ensure affordability. And another option would be to focus more on housing type, so using preference surveys and population and demographic forecasts to estimate future demand by housing type. And this was a component of the housing analysis included in Reno's last master plan update. So obviously all of these are important and relevant questions to examine within the context of our future housing inventory, which is a very big and complex issue. So we're looking forward to digging into this a little more in the coming months. And I will turn it over to Michelle for our final update.
Great. So Michelle Laramie for the record. And our last project update is on the inventory of regional sustainability planning tools and techniques. And we're now nearing completion of this research project. Just as a quick reminder, this slide gives you a general idea of how we've approached this project and the different phases of the research we've worked through. And we did go over this in some detail at our last meeting, so I won't dive into it again here. But I did just want to highlight that since we last presented, we've now met twice with a technical advisory group and have worked to incorporate their feedback into the draft that was shared in the backup material for today's meeting. Next slide. So once the report is finalized, we'll have 3 primary outcomes, which can be used as tools for either your agency's individual work or future collaborative work in environmental sustainability planning in the region. And the first outcome is, of course, the final report itself, which details our research findings. And generally, we found that there appears to be 2 broad approaches to sustainability planning, either local efforts by individual jurisdictions that, when added together, may have some regional impact, or collaborative multi-jurisdictional approaches. And the best practices section of the report follows an analysis of the general approaches. And that section is grouped into 3 categories. 1, building a foundation, 2, collaborative processes, and 3, final plan components. And we found 12 principles for sustainability planning were identified within these 3 general categories. And these principles highlight the need to determine achievable and measurable goals and strategies, as well as the importance of creating a clear implementation and evaluation process. So specifically, our research also found that many of the elements in sustainability planning have synergies, dependencies, and trade-offs with one another. And so without careful consideration and coordination, strategies may end up inadvertently counteracting or negating one another. And so because of this, our research really highlighted the need for sustainability and climate action to be addressed through collaborative or multi-jurisdictional approaches. And some of the additional principles that are highlighted in the report include the need for broad and inclusive community engagement, where equity and environmental justice are centered in the plan. And then in addition to the final report, we've also put together a decision tree that highlights the different approaches to sustainability planning, as well as a plan comparison matrix that details some of the sustainability and climate action plans that were reviewed as part of our research. Next slide. So the plan comparison matrix is still in progress, but here you can see the decision tree diagram that we put together. And we know this is a little hard to read, so we're going to go ahead and zoom in on the following slides. Next slide. So in the local sum of parts approach, local agencies primarily go about sustainability planning work on their own, or perhaps decide that they don't have capacity for it at all. And here you can see that the stacked shapes, they indicate the fact that this work is occurring multiple times throughout the region for each individual jurisdiction. And strategies in this method are developed solely based on individual agency priorities, which may mean there are or are not synergistic efforts within the region. Next slide. The multi-jurisdictional branch approach highlights the overall steps to a collaborative approach and some of the key decision points. And in the multi-jurisdictional approach, there does need to be time dedicated towards negotiating shared values and goals. And because local agencies initially agree on shared goals, it's much more likely that strategies and policies deployed within the region will complement one another. So as far as next steps go, we'll be sharing our final drafts of these deliverables with the Technical Advisory Committee for one final review, as well as some other regional stakeholders for comments over the next couple weeks, and plan to finalize all of these deliverables before the end of next month. And we'll be sharing a full and final report at our next steering committee.
Great. So those are the highlights from our team. If you have any questions, we're more than happy to discuss. As you can see, we've been really hard at working to provide some research and some tools, as well as just ongoing awareness of the regional plan. And so with that, we are complete on this update.
Thank you, Ray and Paul and Michelle. I appreciate your presentations. And can we make sure that these slides are shared with all of the members as well, so that they have this information to be able to look over? And I wanted to see if any of the members have any questions or comments. Paul or Brian?
Mayor March, I do have a question. It relates to the AB 73 committee work going on. Representatives on that committee briefed us last week about a regional analysis of how much cost is associated with the care for those who are homeless in our community. And there was mention of analysis around our housing stock and housing needs in the future. I'm curious the engagement of the Southern Nevada Strong with the AB 73 process.
Ray? Do you have?
Yeah, this is Ray Laker for the record. We have not had communication, although some of our stakeholders and partners might also interface with that committee. But it's great to hear that they're doing that work, and we'll make sure to make sure that we are doing similar, consistent research and look at what they've compiled. So thank you very much for letting us know.
Thank you. I need to point out too, I think right before the Great Recession, the university was working on a jobs housing analysis. So that may be useful information that they were looking at just in terms of the structure and how they were working with the data to help you going forward in terms of the housing analysis as well. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, then we'll move on to the next item. Craig?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, I'm Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the RTC. We'll let the slides advance a little. Okay. So today I'm going to review the onboard plan, which we have completed with substantial input and assistance from our partner organizations, many of whom represented on this committee as well as many other stakeholders. Next slide, please. Again, one more. Okay, there we go. So first I want to review the outreach and engagement activities that we have conducted during the development of this plan. Next slide. The outreach and public engagement efforts we've conducted for Onboard are the most extensive ever undertaken by the RTC over the past nearly 3 years. We've had a presence at more than 300 events. We've given more than 110 speaking engagements. We've had nearly 90,000 in-person contacts. And across the 3 onboard surveys, we've had more than 30,000 responses. We've also had 18 technical advisory group meetings with local agency planners, public works departments, and other partners. Many members of this steering committee participated in some of those. We've also held 4 community stakeholder meetings at key points in the plan development process. So as I prepare to quickly review the 8 onboard strategies, this is probably the right time to acknowledge the realities of the moment that we're in right now. Onboard is an inspirational plan intended to lay out a long-term vision for what mobility and transit in Southern Nevada should look like in 20 or more years. And at the same time we're moving this plan forward, we're also facing an unprecedented funding and transit crisis as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession it has triggered. So while we are proposing a visionary plan that would obviously take significant resources to implement, the RTC is simultaneously proposing transit service changes that would result in a contraction of services. And you'll actually hear more about those in a subsequent presentation. But as the region's metropolitan planning organization, it's very important that we continue to lay out that long-range vision so that as recovery eventually happens, we've already identified what we want to do with the resources that we will have available. But I do, again, just want to emphasize that we understand how difficult this time is and that Onboard will eventually help play a role in the region's recovery. So with that, I'll just do a quick review of the Onboard strategies. We could hold it on this slide for a second. The Onboard recommendations consist of 8 strategies that we're calling big moves, and then 64 specific projects or programs to implement those strategies. And other than some minor wordsmithing, these 8 strategies and the 64 specific projects are unchanged since last August. Because I've presented them to this committee multiple times, I'm only very briefly going to cover each one, but if you have questions, we can answer them at the end of my presentation. So the first of those strategies is the one you see here, to build a high-capacity transit system. It calls for a total of 19 high-capacity transit lines built over 2 phases and totaling just over 200 miles of high-capacity transit. Next slide. The second one of the strategies is to expand transit service to maximize access to jobs and housing. In this slide, the blue area is where the RTC currently provides what we call high-frequency service. The goal in those areas is to continue to increase the service frequency and increase the quality of the service. And then the darker gray area is where the RTC currently operates bus service. The goal there is to get more of those lines operating on a higher frequency, reducing headways, and eventually even get to the point where the use of schedules is not really even necessary. You just go to the bus stop and you know that the next bus will be there within a reasonable amount of time. And then the lighter gray areas, the rest of the urbanized part of the valley. And for those areas, what ONBOARD recommends is it sets a recommendation of trying to provide some form of public mobility or public transit service in those areas. And that could be eventually the extension of bus lines into those areas, but it could also be newer alternatives like rideshare partnerships or micromobility operations that would be able to provide mobility options to the people who live in those areas as well. Next slide. So the third strategy is make all travel options safer and more secure. Fairly self-explanatory title, name. Most of these are relating to safety and security improvements that would make people more willing to use the bus and then walk to and from using the bus. But I do want to also draw attention, it's not just focused on buses and transit. The first bullet point, the traffic crash review and countermeasures program, would have the RTC annually produce a report identifying traffic crash hotspots, as well as work with the local agencies to identify potential countermeasures, and then through our planning process, attempt to find the funding to be able to implement those countermeasures. So next slide. The fourth strategy is to make short trips easier. This one initially was called improve first mile, last mile connections. But as ONBOARD morphed into or evolved into a broader mobility plan, this strategy had to do that as well. And so it includes a lot of things that would definitely improve the ability for people to walk to and from transit and mobility services. But it also takes a broader approach, making some recommendations that would improve the ability of people to choose walking or biking for shorter trips, just trips around the neighborhood, trips to the nearest store, those types of things where they could choose to walk or bike instead of have to get into a car and have that really be the only option. Next slide. So the fifth strategy is to expand service for older adults, veterans, and people with disabilities. And so basically what we're talking about here, the simplest way to put these recommendations is that we're recommending trying to double the services for older adults and veterans, and then and obviously assuming funding were available, try to provide paratransit service throughout the entire urbanized part of the valley. Next slide. Improving connections to major destinations. This one really focuses on improving the airport service and connections to and from the airport and within the airport as well. But it also really does highlight our interest in trying to make sure that there are viable mobility alternatives for people to get to major event destinations, such as the new football stadium, T-Mobile, other venues as well. Without the only option really being to get in the car and drive. Next slide. So big move number 7 is providing reliable transit for resort corridor employees. This really has 2 elements. First one is improving circulation within the resort corridor itself, particularly to employee-focused entrances. So includes identifying locations for transit stations along the strip, and then shuttles that run to the back of house entrances, which are really, in many instances, the encouraged entrances to those work locations for those employees. And then the second part is then improving the reliability and appeal of transit service that would connect people to those shuttle systems that are operating, to make sure that we're serving the places where those residents live and able to get them easily to the system. Next slide. And the last strategy then is leveraging new technology to improve mobility. So this includes some that are transit focused, but it also includes implementation of what the RTC calls the Fast Technology Roadmap. It's branded in ONBOARD as the Fast OS, but that's a plan that was put together maybe 3 years ago to talk about how our ITS, our Intelligent Transportation System, would incorporate new technologies as they become available to try to improve traffic operations. This one also includes some improvements or some recommendations that are really focused on sustainability. So the idea of a long-term transition to an electric transit fleet, and then the idea of installing solar charging stations for personal vehicles as well. So there are a number of options in that one, a number of programs and projects in that one as well. So next slide. It was important for us to understand the economic impacts and benefits that would come from the eventual implementation of ONBOARD. So next slide. So we looked at 4 basic types of economic impacts related to transit and mobility improvements. First are the spending improvements or spending impacts or the multipliers from the actual expenditure of funds. Next were the societal benefits and the economic impacts. So these are the type of benefits that result from, for example, the ability of potential customers to reach businesses that they otherwise wouldn't. Also the ability of workers to be able to reach their jobs reliably. And then the last one, the land value and economic development impacts. These mostly relate to the increases in land value that typically occur after investments in fixed route transit infrastructure and operations. Next slide, please. So economic impact analysis basically boils down to the impacts that would come from the high capacity transit system and the impacts that would come from the other 7 strategies. You can see the summary here for the high capacity transit investments. And I just want to emphasize that these are estimates based on the potential spending and investment that would have to come with building a high capacity transit system on this full scale of what's developed or what's recommended in ONBOARD. But first, the basic multipliers for different activities relating to building a high-capacity transit system are roughly 1.5 to 1.6. So $1 spent on one of those activities has the effect of spending 1.5 to 1.6 in the economy because it trickles through and is spent in other ways. The societal benefits would exceed the investment costs over the full 20-year period of the plan. The economic growth impacts would be more than $2 billion. And then the land value impacts would be about a 1 to 6% increase in property values. When you factor in the significant value of land within half a mile of those high capacity transit routes that we showed you on that earlier map, such an investment would generate a massive increase in land value in the region. And then just a reminder that the ONBOARD plan also has similar analysis for the other 7 strategies. So next I'll cover the results from the final ONBOARD survey. As onboard was being finalized, we wanted to find out and hopefully, to make sure to confirm that the project team, the consultants, the TAG had effectively captured what the public think the region needs for mobility and transit. This survey was conducted from January to March. People could view each of the 8 strategies, read a brief description of them, and read about the implementing projects. And then they were asked to rate each of the strategies on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. We received about 10,500 unique responses. So this slide shows the overall ratings of all 8 of the recommended strategies. All 8 of those received between 4.3 and 4.5 on that 5-point scale. And we interpret that as a fairly strong indicator that the strategies do reflect what we heard throughout all of that public engagement and technical work and the collaboration with stakeholders. This slide shows the number of responses for each rating that the 8 strategies received. The overall majority of them were 5 stars. Because 1 star is the lowest possible rating, we interpret that as no support or even opposition, but that was very low, averaging about 3%. One of the demographic questions we asked was zip code where the respondents live. This map shows those responses, and it demonstrates that they were spread across the valley. Obviously, there are concentrations and areas with lower levels, but this represents a fairly good distribution across the valley. Other demographics that we asked about were income, race, age, and gender. I won't linger too long on this slide and the next couple, but they do show that they do show just some of these results from these different demographic groupings. So this first one is income. You can see in this table how the survey sample matches very closely with Clark County as a whole. And then the chart next to it shows how lower income respondents overall rated the onboard strategies a little bit higher than the overall responses. This slide shows how higher income respondents rated the mobility strategies, generally a little lower than the overall survey respondents. And next, we'll briefly just show the race and ethnicity demographics and responses. On average, racial and ethnic minority respondents rated the onboard recommendations a little bit higher than the overall survey group. Finally, this slide, the next slide, shows a summary of the responses from a larger set of different demographic breakouts. And I'll leave it here for just a couple of seconds so you can kind of see what some of those patterns look like. Okay, so the last topic I'll cover are the final steps and timeline as we carry onboard through to approval by the RTC board. So the consultant contract ended at the end of June. We have met with each of the local governments in the Valley to review the plan and recommendations. We've also held a series of virtual drop-in briefings with the technical advisory group participants. We've presented the plan to the Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee, and then earlier today to the Executive Advisory Committee, which has also recommended approval. The timing of the next steps after that they're still somewhat fluid, but will probably consist of developing a cost estimate and a hypothetical funding mechanism. You could think of it, for those who are involved in our transportation funding planning, of like a capital improvements program, a potential capital improvements program for onboard. And then that would be taken along with the plan document itself to the RTC board in October and November for final approval. Onboard will also become a component of the regional transportation plan. So all or most of the projects, at least, will be included as unfunded projects in the next regional transportation plan, which will be adopted in December or January. And then after that, we will keep the plan alive and move on to working with local governments towards implementation of the plan. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions or comments for Craig with regards to the onboard? Craig, I do have a question for you. We started this process probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, correct? And that was well before the pandemic. And so I wonder if there's some flexibility in the plan. Obviously, revenues are down right now, but as things come back, would there be flexibility in terms of what we might implement now versus maybe a year from now? And is this considered a long-term plan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so ONBOARD was actually put together to identify all of the things that the region wants, and then gradually over time, we start figuring out the actual implementation for each one of those. And so, the impacts of COVID they're obviously going to delay the implementation of ONBOARD and some of the recommendations, but they don't really change the recommendations. I'll also note that throughout the executive summary, as well as in the plan itself, we've called out a few points where it's the reality of the moment. We couldn't possibly put out a plan like this without acknowledging and discussing some of those impacts. And so we've done that throughout the plan, and we've also highlighted the role that the plan could play in economic recovery, as the pieces of mobility infrastructure can help support an economic recovery pretty significantly.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Then we can move on to the next item.
Thank you, Chair March. The next item on the agenda is an update on the implementation of the regional policy plan from the City of Las Vegas. And Mr. Marco Vallata from the City of Las Vegas will provide the update. Mr. Vallata.
Thanks, Craig. Marco Vallata for the record. We'll go on to the next slide. Over the past year, the city and its consulting team, Smith Group, have been drafting the city's 2050 master plan. And since the last time I spoke with the committee, work on that first draft is wrapping up as we prepare to circulate it around for public comment. Today, I'm going to share with you how the plan aligns with Southern Nevada Strong and discuss how we've developed a framework for the future of Las Vegas and implement it. Next slide. As a brief recap, the currently adopted 2020 master plan was at the end of its life cycle, and the city's seen considerable change over the last 2 decades. And because of the effects of the Great Recession, it was time to address the future socioeconomic changes and the need to anticipate the growing population. Next slide. Based on preliminary work, our land use projections contemplate a future where infill and redevelopment will largely be required. Because the city is landlocked and cannot expand any further, Las Vegas is faced with building up and not out. This is going to result in higher densities and more mixed-use type buildings. Consequently, this model aligns well with future transportation projects, a future compact urban structure, and more efficient use of water. Next slide. As a result, the city is anticipated to add approximately 300,000 new residents by 2050, and that's in line with consensus population projections from UNLV. That's obviously going to necessitate new police, new teachers, new schools, new housing, new commercial space, and new infrastructure and services. Next slide. Throughout the planning process, we've received considerable input from the community. We've conducted multiple surveys and have gone out to the community to hear priorities of the public and stakeholders. Next slide. Not surprisingly, we've heard consistent themes and issues that's been consistent over time, but many of which we've heard about and were addressed in the Southern Nevada Strong Plan as it was being developed. The top challenges facing the city in the future are certainly concerns about education, crime and public safety, homelessness, and changing environment, especially with respect to drought. Next slide. To address those concerns, we've prepared a vision that was drafted and agreed to by our Planning Commission and City Council members. And ultimately, this statement addresses what the community wants to be like over the next 30 years. slide. To get the city to that point are a series of guiding principles which are incorporated into the vision. Throughout the plan, we've made sure to address how each issue addresses equity, resilience, health, quality of life, and innovation. Next slide. Each of the plan's chapters are structured in a way that allows the city to set goals and measure performance with desired outcomes. So to achieve a goal and the desired outcome, we have tools and strategies and implementation actions that are recommended for overall plan implementation. Some of these are going to require policy changes, others may require city department action, and others will require collaboration with regional stakeholders and partners. Next slide.
Are we able to recover where we were?
Yes, just give me one moment. My apologies.
No problem.
We'll go back to, yep, right there. And if you go on to the next slide. So I'm going to give the committee a bit of a preview of the content of the draft, and kind of saw a little bit of it there, and focus on some of the plan's features and the content itself. So in our land use and environment chapter, we have 3 sections. The first describes the existing conditions of 16 areas of the city. We divided it up in these groups which closely align with census geography, and these are essentially groups of neighborhoods, districts, and places. Some of them, as you can see here, have some familiar place names that already exist, such as Summerlin and downtown Las Vegas and Centennial Hills. Next slide. But each area ultimately will allow the city to do more in-depth neighborhood level planning. And the intent is that the city will focus on each of these areas to ensure that the goals from all the chapters are met. So specific projects, land use and zoning changes, programs are likely to further develop in this manner. Next slide. So to give an idea of what that contains, these are some excerpts for the Charleston area. And as you can see here, you can see all the existing and future facilities and infrastructure that's being proposed, as well as some of the proposed land use changes that would facilitate new population growth. We also identify key demographics and socioeconomic indicators. And if you go on to the next slide, you can see important metrics such as proximity to services, park availability, jobs, housing balance, and transportation. And this is done for every area of the city for what's existing and what's proposed. Next slide. So overall, the land use section provides this template for which the city is proposed to grow. And the basic model for that is transit-oriented development. And that closely aligns with Craig's presentation on the onboard mobility plan. Specifically, we're looking to tie those major regional centers that were developed and identified during Southern Nevada Strong and link them together with major arterial corridors such as Charleston Boulevard, Decatur Boulevard, so on. I'm going to take you now through a number of the place types and land uses to give you an idea of what they are quickly. Next slide. So the regional centers themselves are the presently established regional HUDs with the greatest and most important intensities and locations. So this would be, for example, downtown Las Vegas, Centennial Hills Town Center near 215 and 95 in the Northwest. Next slide. Between the regional centers are transit-oriented development mixed-use centers. And these have less intensity, but would feature new zoning that would accommodate a mix of uses and intensities and are intended to be walkable and compatible with the onboard high-capacity transit system. Next slide. The corridors themselves are what end up linking everything together. So these would feature linear style mixed use and increase the corridor's overall walkability and have a lot of the same features that you would find in a transit-oriented development. Next slide. We do have some areas that that are outside of those locations where that aren't really transit served now, but maybe in the future. And those are opportunities for, I guess, what you call micro transit-oriented development. These are neighborhood mixed-use centers that are recommended as smaller town centers that can be integrated into areas that have existing development already. So a shopping center that has no anchor tenant anymore, or somewhere where you have a large amount of parking in a suburban area where you could build some additional buildings. Next slide. So those are the new basic place types, but we have other land use recommendations that instead require changes to our Title 19 Unified Development Code for areas between those major nodes and corridors. So mixed residential opportunities may allow for increased densities and new missing middle housing types, for example. Next slide. Older neighborhoods, however, may require preservation. And some change may occur in these areas, but the idea is that these places are more preservation oriented, and if anything happens, only minor enhancements may occur, some infill and some conversions between homes and offices and things like that. Next slide. There may also be opportunities for retrofit and enhancement of existing subdivisions. Some of the current subdivisions of today, as they age, opportunities may develop to make strategic enhancements, make new connections where there are none now. And then we also have land in the northwestern areas that will continue to develop as new subdivisions, including those that are under existing development agreements like Summerlin West and Sky Canyon. And those will continue to develop themselves out over time. Next slide. Finally, we did hear the desire from a lot of people that they wanted to maintain a semi-rural suburban character in certain areas. So this would include places with large lots and branch estates. Next slide. So as you can see here, and you can click through the next 3 slides. You know, we've seen a dramatic amount of change over time, and as you can see from those maps, our existing land use map is totally different 20 years ago, and a lot of the land in the west and the northwest developed itself out. So as we develop over the next 30 years, we're likely to see us reach the extent of the city limits, thus necessitating this strategy of transit-oriented development place types that we're proposing to accommodate that overall strategy for infill and redevelopment and building up instead of going out. And hopefully what we end up seeing is, in the next 2 slides here, places like Charleston and Decatur Boulevard. Next slide. So you can see what we have here today. We couple incentives and transportation improvements together, as well as appropriate urban design standards through our zoning code. We can take this type of intersection and transform it into something like the you'll see in the next slide. Okay. Next slide. So the remainder of this chapter on land use environment examines other environmental issues within the city and region as a whole. The plan discusses issues such as extreme heat, which is anticipated to continue occurring with greater frequency and intensity, as Paul and Ray talked about. And we discuss how it can be mitigated with drought-tolerant tree canopies, parks, and open space. Next slide. We also have a better understanding of the region's food systems. And although this section was written before the pandemic, we all experienced the food supply chain issue several months ago. But we did delve into the intersection of that and transportation. We also took a look at the intersection of pollution related to specific community groups, as well as possible strategies for decreasing exposure and environmental risk. Next slide. Our economy and workforce chapter discusses several new but important elements that we heard quite a bit about during our public outreach. We took a close look at recent trends and educational outcomes and the major differences between urban and suburban schools, as well as the overall need for future school capacity. Next slide. educational outcomes are going to translate to workforce and economic outcomes as well. So we align redevelopment and urban development with an overall targeted regional strategy like the one that's being implemented through the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance will ultimately make for a more diversified economy in the future, while gaming and tourism is still a recognized global leader. Next slide. As the new places develop throughout the city, we definitely need new missing middle housing types. Much of the city's and Southern Nevada's housing is of a single-family residential type or a standard apartment. But more housing diversity will go a long way to addressing affordability as well as addressing homelessness. Next slide. Our Systems and Services chapter discusses major infrastructure projects and programs. The transportation section specifically discuss and align with RTC strategies for high-capacity transit and an overall push to reduce DMT and increasing modal shares. That said, the plan also contemplates new innovations such as transportation electrification and autonomous vehicles. Next slide. We pride ourselves on being a leader in sustainability, and this plan aligns and anticipates the drought and decreased water supply and is very intertwined with SNWA's overall goals of reducing per capita water consumption. So continued progress on clean energy, waste, and emissions will further set Las Vegas apart, but it has to continue the mitigation and adaptation efforts with respect to our changing climatic conditions. Next slide. Growing number of, as our community grows over time, what we're going to continue to see is demand for more public facilities and services. So more space and access to facilities is forecasted, as well as coordination for necessary infrastructure. We also took a look at the work of Southern Nevada Health District and the importance of public health, as well as the need for more doctors that will graduate out of the UNLV School of Medicine. So considerable effort did go into assessing healthcare access and the needs for new hospitals and improved health indicators. Next slide. So finally, the chapter concludes with an updated hazard assessment that factors in adaptive capacity and sensitivity between all the systems that were mentioned in the other chapters. So this framework provides general strategies for mitigating a hazard, adapting to it, responding to it, and recovering from it, whether it's natural or a man-made type of a hazard. We also took a look at the public's priorities for public safety. Property and violent crime rates have been decreasing over time, but we do need to continue a collaborative, community-oriented effort to develop a safe community strategy. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, to implement these goals, this plan is really a guide. It proposes 2-year action plans that leverage specific tools to achieve both short-term and long-term outcomes. And it's not a planning department plan, it's the citywide plan. So as such, it's going to require continued collaboration between the departments of the city, as well as the agencies of Southern Nevada, the community at large, and the public. And the next steps for us are going to be to continue conducting reviews of the plan internally, and then we're going to post the public review draft in the next month at masterplan.vegas. We're aiming for a December adoption date by our Planning Commission and City Council. Next slide. So I'm quickly going to switch gears and show implementation at a bit of a micro scale here. With Southern Nevada Strong, we have Maryland Parkway and Las Vegas Medical District as opportunity sites, and to show that link between plan and putting it into action. The medical district strategies are in direct alignment with the Southern Nevada Strong vision, as well as the Downtown Las Vegas Master Plan, which is a part of our overall 2050 Master Plan. So the medical district is one of those 12 districts of downtown, and envisioned to have all the features that were contemplated for other parts of downtown as well, having complete streets and more parks and places for people, as well as a form-based zoning code, which we've implemented. Next slide. So both regulation and capital infrastructure have been emphasized for the medical district. This area was the first to adopt the city's new form-based zoning code, which is part of our Title 19. And essentially, it enables increased density, walkability, and mixed-use transit-oriented development in each of the transect zones that you see in that map there. A key feature of it is that it provides a degree of predictability because the zoning map is directly tied back to that overall downtown master plan vision. A lot of the infrastructure work has been going on here as well. We've had several complete street projects finish up. We have Charleston Boulevard as well, a lot of pedestrian improvements, anticipated high capacity transit, autonomous shuttle project, as well as a future parking garage, all of which have been completed or are under development. Next slide. So that's all on the kind of the public side of things, but on the private side, we continue to have a lot of work in getting these major medical district catalytic projects off the ground. By far, one of the most important is, of course, the UNLV School of Medicine and getting the first building in and constructed. UNLV has definitely had a lot of success in graduating its class and having students start going through the system. I do like to kind of compare this with the evolution of the University of Colorado Anschutz campus in Aurora, in which they converted the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital, and CU invested billions into the hospital's care facilities and classrooms and lab space there. RTD later built a light rail line with a station that's a close walk to the campus, and immediately across the street from that station is mixed-use transit-oriented development housing. So I think of it as a place the medical district can aspire to, and I think certainly the plan in Southern Nevada Strong have spoken to that over time. Next slide. And then finally, we've been working jointly with RTC and the county on the Maryland Parkway Opportunity Site in the form of the Maryland Parkway TOD Plan Grant. And so far, we've completed the initial reports with the consultants, MIG, as well as TOD for different focus areas, including the medical district, Bonneville Transit Center. As we work through the latter half of the year, there's going to be additional opportunities to look at specific areas that we hope to translate into specific implementation and action items that can be adopted by our Planning Commission and City Council. So in summary, between all these initiatives here, we've been working to make sure that we're well aligned and consistent with Southern Nevada Strong in terms of the overall implementation of it. And that concludes my presentation, and I'll take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was excellent. It's exciting to see the plan, and I love the idea that it's a citywide plan. It's not just the planning department's plan, because I think you as you incorporate all of your departments and they all own the plan, you have a whole lot better chance of achieving all of the goals in the plan. It's very well done. Very well done. Anyone have a comment, question?
Mayor March, I appreciate the opportunity, and Marco, as always, you do a fantastic job presenting. As it relates to Southern Nevada Strong, I think there's continued opportunities to make sure that our planning processes are aligned with the goals of Southern Nevada Strong. And in my role, I both look forward to figuring out how we can make sure they're connected and achieving the outcome we're all looking for. So I appreciate the opportunity to share the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Anyone else? Thank you very much, Marco. I appreciate that presentation. And maybe if you, I don't know if you're going to be sharing those slides through the community or.
Yeah, yes, we'll make sure that they're shared with each of you, and I believe there's a PDF that went along with this.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rayburn?
Thank you, Chair March. Our next item is to receive a presentation on the Comprehensive Plan Development Code update from Clark County. Mr. Mario Bermudez with Clark County is going to provide the presentation. Mr. Bermudez.
Thank you, Craig. This is Mario Bermudez for the record. And So I'm going to take you through where we are right now with the update to our master plan and development code. We are just in the beginning stages of it. We're 7 months in. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background, starting last year, the county commissioners had some discussions with us during their briefings and then in a county commission meeting about updating our code. Our code was adopted in 2000. It's Title 30. And what they were looking for is a more user-friendly code. One of the comments made is that they would like it to be understood by a 5th grader. So that's what we're going to try to attain. Kind of tough, but I think we can at least make it a little bit more simpler. Subsequent discussions with the commissioners centered on updating both the master plan and the code. The comprehensive plan was last updated in 1983 as a whole document. There have been subsequent updates since then, but over time, they've lost their alignment to one another and to the development code. Next slide, please. So the purposes of this project is to get the plan and code more in alignment with one another. Look at how we can streamline our process for processing developments. Can we do more projects at an administrative level? Some projects require both the planning commission and the county commission approval, or at least going through both steps. Can we eliminate it so that it just goes to the planning commission or the county commissioner or county commission? In updating these two documents, we're looking at a closer alignment between the policies and the regulations. As I stated, over time, we've updated each of the elements, each of our land use plans, but as much as we tried, the alignment has been kind of lost. And specifically here, what we're looking at is also to implement the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan, but we'll also be looking at other regional plans that are updated and adopted. Next slide. So as I indicated, we just started January of this year. We kicked off with our consultant. This is a full 3-year process to take us to the end of December of 2022. So right now we're in stages or steps 2 and 3 with the state of the county and the visions and goals. We had anticipated having our kickoff meeting in March of this year, but of course the pandemic has affected us just like everyone else. So we weren't able to have our kickoff meetings until June. But I don't believe, well, it's not going to delay us at this time. We've made some adjustments, but we're staying on track. Next slide. So the purpose of the plan is to take us through 2050. So we're looking at about a 30-year time frame. We're looking at the plan, obviously, to show us how and where we can grow. Some of our policies currently are written in a regulatory fashion. We obviously want to take that out and make it more advisory. They are policies. We do have goals. Put the regulations where they belong in the development code. This document does serve as an umbrella for other more detailed plans that we have, such as our the land use plans that we have as part of the comprehensive plan. And it will support regional plan objectives, as indicated that we are looking at implementing a lot of the policies that come out of the S&S plan and the onboard plan. Next slide. So the plan's objectives for the rewrite. So we have the 8 elements that are required by NRS. We have 11 different land use planning areas. And in those planning areas, we have 19 town advisory boards and citizen advisory councils. So what we want to do is try to address each one of those planning areas, each one of those TABs, CACs, and recognize how they are different from one another. Even though a lot of our town boards, and they are rural in nature. They're outlying. Moapa Valley is different from Searchlight, which is different from Mount Charleston. So we want to highlight those differences and recognize that they need to be treated differently. Next slide. So additionally, what we want to do is reduce the number of categories that we have. We currently have 21 land use categories. Of those 21, there's 11 categories that are residential. We think by reducing, especially the residential categories, if we can reduce the number of categories, then we can provide more flexibility to the community and to the decision makers. Next slide. As indicated earlier, the purpose of the code update is to make it more readable, more user-friendly, and it is the tool for implementing the master plan. Next slide. So again, just more of the objectives is to better align the zoning districts with the land use categories, make the regulations a little bit more predictable, and address county priorities such as housing diversity and sustainable development. Next slide. This slide timeframe shows where we will be with the development code. So steps 1 and 4, it's overlapping with the update to the plan. But as we move along, we'll more focus on the development code, and that'll come beginning of next year, all the way through December of 2022. Next slide. Next. So for input, we currently have a questionnaire that's out there. It does close tomorrow. I think as of last week, we had about 1,000 responses. In June, as I indicated, we did have our kickoff meetings, and that was with the county commissioners, planning commissioners, comprehensive planning staff, other department staff, other agencies, our town advisory board, and citizen advisory council, and other stakeholders. So I believe that with all those groups, we're at around 200 people that we're trying to engage at this time. And I'd say every week I've been getting some more names to add to the list. And we will be providing updates to the Planning Commission, County Commission, as well as everyone else involved. Our next set of updates we're hoping will take place in September of this year. Next slide. And this just shows a page out of our online questionnaire. This is just really to learn about what people think about the county and what they would like to see for the future of the county. Next slide. So we just ask that everybody can, if you want to, you can follow the process. We do have a project website. It is transformclarkcounty.com, or you can email us at transformclarkcounty@clarkcountynv.gov. I'd just like to say that as we move forward, just really want to reiterate that we will be looking at other plans. A lot of things that the city of Las Vegas are doing, and we'll be looking at the same things. We'll be looking at how we address the edges with all of the other jurisdictions, how we complement the other jurisdictions' zoning and land use. Next slide. Next. So this summarizes everything that the questionnaire is open through the end of July. We had our kickoff meetings in in June. We've just now posted the preliminary visions and goals to our website, as well as a summary of the online questionnaire. So you can go ahead and take a look at that if you'd like. One thing I do want to emphasize is something that Margaret brought up, that this is not just the the comprehensive planning department's document. What we're trying to really get the message out there and educate people on is, although we are the lead department when it comes to the plan, it is a community-wide plan. It is a county-wide plan. A lot of the elements that are in there will be addressed by other departments, and they have just as big of a stake in this document as we do. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Because that concludes my presentation. So I will answer any any questions that the committee may have.
Thank.
Was that for me, Mayor March?
Unmute. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, thank you very much. Somehow I got someone else. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I love the added point that you made, that this too mirrors the whole community's plan, and that while it is the plan of the community development department, it really is all of your departments, so that everyone's marching in the same direction, if you will, and that they all own the vision of the future for your community for the next 30 years. Are there any questions or comments? Does anyone have anything more they want to add? Mario, well done. Thank you. And would you mind coming back in the future, maybe giving us updates as you go along?
I'd be more than happy to. Not a problem.
Thank you. Anyone else? Craig, can we move on to the next item?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So our next item is to receive a presentation regarding the proposed fall 2020 transit service changes. Mr. Francis Julian, Deputy CEO for the RTC, is going to provide the presentation. Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman. Today, we'll briefly review the RTC's budget and the proposal transit service changes for the fall of the upcoming fall. Next slide, please. As we all know and have experienced, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the global economy, our transportation infrastructure system, and has changed life as we know it. At the RTC, similar to other local agencies, we have taken several actions to mitigate the financial impacts of COVID-19. Prior to COVID-19, our transit service was already facing significant fiscal strain. As you can see on the chart, fiscal year 2020, our predictions was to end with a fiscal imbalance of $6 million, and our projection for FY 2021 was minus $20 million. With COVID hitting, we actually ended up our fiscal year at minus $24 million, and we're projecting finishing our current fiscal year at $102 million. To adjust for the budget deficit internally, we cut nearly $40 million of our budget. If you could click, please, on the slide. Next slide, please. How did we make those cuts? We actually eliminated and postponed some capital projects. We suspended and cut a lot of our contracts. We're currently in a hiring freeze. Management took pay cuts up to 5%. We just recently negotiated a collective bargaining agreement where our employees took a pay cut. We laid off or furloughed nearly 15% of our workforce, and we're proposing significant reduction, which I'll talk about in this presentation. Next slide, please. While all transit agencies are currently facing significant challenge due to COVID-19, the RTC is in a very unique position because of two reasons. Our system is primarily funded by fare revenue and sales tax revenue. Other transit agencies across the country fund their transit services from multiple funding sources to include not only sales tax and fares, but also property tax, fuel tax, and T&C taxes. Second, prior to this pandemic, we were already facing a transit funding shortfall, and as a community whose economy relies primarily on the tourism industry, how and when we recover may look really different from our peers. Thanks to the Coronavirus Aid and Economic Security CARES Act, the RTC will receive $112 million in federal funds. We already used nearly 24 million of CARES Act funding to fill the gap for FY 2020, 64 million of CARES Act funding for FY 2021, and the remaining 24 million for FY 2022. The CARES Act is a temporary solution. There is likely no additional transit funding coming from the federal government to address this crisis. As I mentioned, long-term funding for transit services will continue to be a serious challenge that we are going to have to address by FY 2022. Again, we're proposing significant cuts to our transit service for this fall and may need to make additional adjustments in the future. Next slide, please. So the service changes overview are basically categorized in 3 buckets. We're proposing route eliminations, adjustments to existing routes, and route frequency decrease. Next slide, please. We started a 60-day public comment back in June 29 that will last until August 28, where we're asking individuals to visit our website and really share their thoughts on the changes that we will be proposing. To date, just as a note, we're up to 3,200 responses from the survey, which is really good outreach. Next slide, please. So to reach our community, first of all, let me talk about objectives and goals. So our objectives are to educate, listen, and learn. So educating is basically sharing in a clear and concise fashion what those changes will be. Listening by gathering the feedback from our community, and learning, so basically analyzing the data of hotspots and making adjustment if possible and if appropriate. Our goal is to reach 100% of pre-COVID weekday residential riders on the impacted route, reach all the paratransit riders that will be affected, and receive input from 25% of pre-COVID residential ridership. What are the tactics? The tactics is internal communication, so internal communication with our contractors and our peers. The briefings we've done and we still will be doing with elected officials, community engagement, public relations, and marketing. Next slide, please. So what are we doing specifically for the routes that I'll be talking about? We're actually really targeting the community engagement, whether with in-person engagement. There's mailers, there's door hanger, obviously, digital advertisements, and targeted marketing for those individuals. Next slide, please. Okay, let's go into specifics of the routes. Next slide, thank you. So the first change is something we would have likely done. The Valley View route, Route 104, historically was going on Arville. The reason was there was no connection at Harmon. So with the new construction of the Harmon Bridge, it's just a natural path for that route to stay on Arville. But as you can see, we're still doing heavy marketing for the businesses and residents of that area to get their feedback on the movement. It's about half a mile movement on that trunk of the Valley View route for those riders. Next slide, please. The Route 122, the Maryland Parkway Horizon Ridge in Henderson, the route frequency will be reduced from every 30 minutes during weekdays to every 50 minutes. The route will maintain a 60-minute frequency during the weekend, just like it has. It's important to note that since the pandemic, this route was on a 60-minute frequency. Next slide, please. Route 207, the Alta Stewart, we're proposing to discontinue this route. Most of the routes in the valley are 1 mile apart. This particular route is actually half a mile from a really high frequency route, which are Bonanza and Charleston. We are proposing to put a Silver Star service 3 to 4 days a week. A Silver Star service is a service with a smaller vehicle where we're actually servicing apartment complex and we're linking them to grocery stores, pharmacies, or doctor's offices. We're doing really heavy outreach in that area, obviously, because the route will be discontinued. So businesses and residential areas. Right now, what we found is that 98.8% of the residents and 99.8% of the job within half a mile of that route are also within half a mile of the other routes we have. Next slide, please. Route 209 basically has the same, it's the same situation. It's a route we'll discontinue. It is at half a mile of both Lake Mead and Washington. And we will as well replace it with a Silver Star route. Just like the Route 207, at this time, 99.6% of residents are within half a mile, that are within half a mile of that route are within the same half a mile of a different route. Next slide, please. Sahara Express. So our Sahara Express on the east side is actually branching out in what we call the SXA and the SXB right now. We're proposing to discontinue the SXA branch because there's redundant transit. We have really frequent service on the Nellis route and on the Lake Mead Boulevard route, and just making that service more direct and to stay within its line. Next line, please. The WAX and the CX. So we're proposing to discontinue the WAX and heavily modify the CX. Basically what we're doing, these were two lower productivity routes that we had, and we're actually merging the most popular stops of both routes. So basically a customer would leave the Centennial Transit Center, go directly to the Bonneville Transit Center, then jump on the highway, go to UNLV, and then end the trip at Terminal 1 or 3 at the airport. We think this will really be an efficient new route, and we're basically maximizing the strong point of two older routes. Next slide, please. For the Henderson Downtown Express, which was the Boulder City route, we're proposing to end this route at Water Street in Henderson. So basically discontinue the service from Water Street to the downtown area. Customers would have the opportunity to take the Boulder Highway Express. The total journey would be increased by 20 minutes. The only good thing about this change is frequency for residents of Boulder City to go to Henderson and to and from Henderson would actually increase slightly. Next slide, please. The Strip and Downtown Express and the Deuce on the Strip. So we're proposing to discontinue the Strip and Downtown Express and extend the Deuce service 24 hours where the SDX was servicing. So those two routes in the past shared over 97% of their stops. The only area in our plan that would not be covered would be the convention center. We believe with the new people mover of the Boring Company, that bridge will be done. And in the case of large conventions, the RTC always has service or circulators servicing the convention center. There's a portion in downtown just in front of the Las Vegas Premium Outlet Mall that is not serviced by the Deuce. Our Deuces are double deckers, so there's certain bridge where we do not have the clearance. We actually would have a shuttle that would actually bridge the Deuce. So people going on the Strip would actually be able to have access still to the Las Vegas Premium Outlet Mall. Next slide, please. For paratransit, this plan actually, first of all, the goal of the plan and the cuts that were chosen was to not reduce our transit services. We just wanted to try to reduce the number of redundant services that we have, so the impact would be the least on our community. Unfortunately, there's still 0.3 mile of our total service area that is contracted, which equates to 12 paratransit customers. Those 12 paratransit customers are being contacted directly, either by email, by phone, or by letters. And important to note, out of those 12 customers, only one customer took one ride in the previous years. But we will obviously still do a one-on-one approach with that population. Next slide, please. So for the outreach, the outreach started this week. Tuesday we had a YouTube live that aired from the RTC. We had a transit advisory committee yesterday, and next week we'll be in person at the BTC to take some of the comments and suggestions from our customers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, public comment period is from June 29 to August 28. We will be seeking board approval on September 10th. And the service change could occur as quickly as October 4th. And this concludes my report. I'm available to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Appreciate the update. Are there any questions for Francis?
It looks like we have a hand raised from KCM.
Yes.
Yeah, Madam Chair. Just quick question as far as, I mean, we saw earlier, as far as some of the onboard outreach and looking at community needs and whatnot with the high capacity transits and things like that. And just forecasting out in terms of projected deficit for 2021, I believe it showed. Just curious how we kind of reconcile those efforts with what we're facing on the funding side. And I guess looking forward, you know, I'm sure you're hindered by your capacity constraints within the current COVID environment. But in the event that gets somewhat solved as we go into next year, would that help our position or so just curious in terms of reconciling the two and kind of what's our best case going forward?
Francis?
Yes, as I mentioned, we even before COVID, we were facing a fiscal imbalance. So we definitely will have at the RTC for the transit operations to get new sources of funding to continue and grow and expand the transit system.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Mayor.
Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Mayor Mark, this is MJ.
It's MJ.
Just to confirm what Francis is saying, Francis is right. Pre-pandemic, we were looking for short-term funding solutions, and we were working closely with the local jurisdictions. And I think we were again on the precipice of doing some really great things pre-COVID. The conversation, because the structural deficit is not just next year, it's into every single fiscal year going forward. And so as a community, we're really going to have to look at not only identifying how we maintain our current level of service, but how do we grow our mobility plan on board well into the future. So as you know, Mayor, we're working closely with our board, conversations that will take place, I'm assuming, during this next legislative session. And then, of course, it's going to be dependent on what the community wants to do. So there's a lot of conversation about how we are going to continue to meet the mobility needs of our community.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
I had a question for Francis. This is Andrew with the City of Henderson. The express bus that you showed on Boulder Highway, just so we understand, because there'd be some implications from a zoning standpoint. Are you the Water Street is that the last stop that you'll have going south, or would it be north into Henderson or north kind of towards the county into Whitney Township? And the reason we ask is that we provide a parking reduction incentive if you're within a certain proximity to an express bus route or stop, and we're in negotiations with the developer right now. And if that stop goes away, we might have to reconsider the ability that we have to provide them with that incentive.
If you can reach out to me, because we're actually working already on alternatives from the feedback we're getting from the community on this specific route. We're already getting good feedback, and we actually are most likely will do a small modification to this change. Right now, on the immediate, the plan was for the route to run in between Boulder City and stop on Water Street, but there might be a chance that the route would be extended to go to Galleria Mall, but
Gotcha.
we're actually studying that right now.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll reach out to you directly. And just for clarification, the area we're talking about is closer up to Union Village as you get kind of north and in Henderson's boundary, like closer to Gibson Broadbent. So it sounds like
Okay.
there probably wouldn't be a change in that direction.
No, in that direction there wouldn't be any change.
But I'll reach out to you directly. Thank you very much. It was great information.
Thank you. And obviously, we're concerned about, folks that are going to be going to the Nevada State College or the College of Southern Nevada and having access to those facilities as well going into Las Vegas and North Las Vegas. So that's important. But I also wanted to share how important it is. I know as we are looking at, I think we should probably monitor these routes that we're discontinuing, especially in those neighborhoods that have the greatest need, just to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our residents who maybe don't have any other means of transportation. But from listening to your presentation, it sounds like we do have something within a half a mile walking distance.
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Mayor March, this is Brian Knudsen, and I appreciate the presentation. I've heard it a couple times now, Francis, so I appreciate you putting the time and energy into it. I just want to reiterate my point that I made at the council meeting that so many of our conversations around our community are around transit-oriented development. And if we don't have a path identified for funding transit, we're in a world of hurt. So I would love for future presentations to be on all of the options so that we can talk about the future of funding transit.
And maybe we all need to be ready for the next legislative session if it requires some transit solution to be taken up in the next session.
That's correct. That's right, Mayor. That's exactly what we're doing.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Rayburn, we'll move on to the next agenda item.
Yes, thank you, Chair March. Our next item is to discuss current work activities and priorities from partners related to implementation of the regional plan. Collaboration and coordination are critical to successful implementation of the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan. And as administrator of that plan, the RTC wants to see and support its implementation. This is time that we set aside during the steering committee meetings to allow regional partners to share any other recent work activities or challenges or opportunities related to implementation of the SNS regional plan.
Is there any discussion here? Does anyone want to talk about some of the activities and priorities that they're working on? I don't hear him. Is someone on? Am I disconnected?
No, you're on, Madam Chair.
Okay. Well, it sounds like there isn't any feedback in this area.
No, I mean, after the presentations. Now, one thing I will note, if members of the committee recall back at the May meeting when I ran through some of the historical context for Southern Nevada Strong Plan as part of the economic recovery from the Great Recession, I did note that an opportunity may be to apply a framework for prioritizing implementation of plan elements. And I think that some of our regional planning staff will probably reach out to a few of the stakeholders to sort of try to test a way to do that. And then if that works, then we'll try to expand it and grow it to other members of the steering committee. So I did at least want to mention that that's an activity that we may start doing that we think is responsive in a number of ways, and that it will help with local agents or our local partners identify ways in which they can, given all of the pressures that they're under right now, keep Southern Nevada Strong plan elements, implementation activities in mind as they're doing their other activities. Plus, it's a good way to help prioritize the plan, especially given the impacts that we know COVID is having on regional priorities. And so it'll be a good effort to do that. So we'll probably start by just piloting with a couple of agencies or stakeholders. So if any of you know that you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me or Ray. And if we haven't heard from anyone soon, we'll probably choose the first victim later on.
Thank you. Any questions or any comments, additional comments? Thank you, Mr. Rayburn. Next item.
Right. So the next item is to discuss future agenda items. Staff regularly seeks guidance from the steering committee on future agenda items to keep the meetings of the committee engaging and informational. So this is just a brief opportunity for committee members to suggest direction on future agenda items and thereby further advance the implementation of the regional plan.
I think probably we might be looking at additional funding sources for discussion. And then as we're nearing the submittal of legislation, we probably should be discussing any potential legislation that might go forward that will have an impact on transportation in our communities.
Okay.
Anyone else? Any comments or suggestions for future agenda items? Perhaps, you know, the city of Las Vegas and their master plan and Clark County and updates as they go along, just to get an update on maybe the adoption of different steps along the way.
Mayor March, if I may, Robert Summerfield. I was kind of interested. I think there may be, because there's some unique stakeholders that are on the steering committee that aren't necessarily part of some of the other stuff. And given that the regional plan speaks about homelessness in a number of areas and its impact on our region, it might be interesting if the SNS team can get anybody that's working on the AB 73 working group, maybe to just give this steering committee an update on what their work is looking like and what are some of the recommendations that may come out of that in anticipation of the next legislative session.
Thank you. That's an excellent suggestion. Can we make sure, Craig, that's on the next agenda?
Yep, we will look into that. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mayor Marsh, Michael Mays for the record, and maybe building on what both Robert and Craig are mentioning, I'm looking to our efforts with the recovery support functions in response to COVID-19, the 4 areas: disaster housing, health and social services, economic recovery, and community planning and capacity building. Certainly looking at how that can tie into SNS as it moves forward to the regional policy group, I think will be beneficial.
That's also an excellent suggestion. Why don't we look at that? And I suspect each entity is working on some aspect of that, so maybe we can have a compiled presentation, Craig.
We will work on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions, suggestions? All excellent. Thank you. We'll move on to the next item, Craig.
Yep. The last item on the agenda is your final citizens participation.
Okay, this is the second time set aside for public comment. Just a reminder that comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words being included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Again, Eileen Pastor for the record. There are no public comments.
Well, then this concludes the public comment period. Thank you very much. If there's no additional comments by our members, I'll close this meeting. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, SNS team.
Thank you, everyone.
Very much.